Grover tried to protect Percy, but Kronos slapped him out of the way like a rag doll. "Grover!" Percy cried. Distracted, Kronos managed to disarm him and he threw Riptide out the window. Percy tried to move, but his body felt slow. It was Kronos' power over time again. "Stop!" Annabeth shouted. "Luke, please! I understand now! You have to trust me!"
"Luke Castellan is dead!" Kronos roared. "His body will burn away as soon as I regain my true form."
Percy was desperate to get up and attack while Kronos was distracted, but Kronos' power still anchored him down. He couldn't understand how Annabeth was gaining the strength to get up on her feet and stand up to Kronos, considering she had just been half dead. And how was she able to resist Kronos' time-slowing powers? Seriously, where in the underworld was all this coming from? Kronos struck her in the face and she fell forward. "Your mother saw your fate," she grunted.
"Service to Kronos!" the Titan roared. "This is my fate!"
"No," Annabeth whimpered. Her eyes were tearing up, maybe from sadness or pain. Percy wasn't sure. "That's not the end, Luke," she said. "The prophecy, she saw what you would do. It applies to you."
"I will crush you!"
"You won't," Annabeth said. "You promised. You're holding Kronos back even now."
"Lies!"
He kicked her in the face and she collapsed. Again. Percy summoned all his will. He managed to rise, but it felt like holding the weight of the sky again. Kronos pointed his sword at Annabeth's face. "Family, Luke," she croaked. "You promised." Percy took a painful step forward. Grover was back on his feet, but he was struggling to move just as Percy was. Neither of them could get close enough to Annabeth. "Promise," Luke groaned. He gasped, like he couldn't get air. "Annabeth?" His voice wasn't the Titan's voice. It was Luke's. "You're bleeding." She tried to reach for her knife, but she was still too weak, and she turned to Percy. "Percy, please." For a moment, Percy felt free to move again. He ran and swiped Luke's sword out of his hand. For some reason, Luke barely paid attention and kept his eyes glued to Annabeth. Percy picked up her dagger, then he threw Luke's sword into the hearth, and it melted into the flames immediately. Now, Percy was all that stood between Kronos and Annabeth. "Don't touch her!" he growled. Anger rippled across his face, and Kronos' voice growled, "Jackson!" His body seemed to go gold. He gasped and talked in Luke's voice again. "Percy, he's changing. He's almost ready. He won't need my body anymore."
"No!"
Kronos growled. Percy tried to attack, but Kronos pushed him with such force he landed next to Annabeth. "Percy, the knife!" she said. "Hero's soul cursed blade shall reap." Percy wasn't sure how her knife applied to the prophecy. It's not like it was a legendary weapon with unique abilities or a big story behind it. But Percy was more worried about why Luke was just standing there, watching them without even making a move. Percy struggled to his feet and picked up the knife. Percy just had to kill him. That was the plan. Luke seemed to know what he was thinking. "You can't do it yourself," he said. "It'll break my control. He'll keep defending himself. Only my hand. I know where I can keep him controlled." Percy raised the knife to strike. Then he looked at Grover helping Annabeth to her feet. He remembered the flashback where Luke and Annabeth first met, and how this dagger once belonged to Luke just before giving it to Annabeth and promising to take care of her. Then he remembered what Rachel had said. "You are not the hero," she had said. "It'll affect what you do." "Please," Luke groaned. "No time." If Kronos regained his true form, there would be no stopping him. He would make Typhon look like a playground bully. A line from the prophecy echoed in Percy's head. A hero's soul, cursed blade shall reap. Percy's whole world tipped upside down. He gave the knife to Luke. Annabeth and Grover watched in shock. Luke grasped the hilt. Percy stood before him, defenseless. With hesitation, he stabbed himself in the chest. Luke howled, and his eyes glowed like lava. The throne room shook, throwing Percy and his friends off their feet. Percy looked away as a bright aura of energy filled the room. When the light died, Percy opened his eyes to see Luke laying at the foot of the hearth. Luke's eyes were normal again, and his old scar reappeared on his face. The trio knelt next to him. Luke looked at Annabeth. "You knew, didn't you?" he said. "I almost killed you, but you knew." "Shh. You were a hero in the end, Luke," she said. "You'll go to Elysium." "Did you love me?" he asked. She looked at Percy, like she was drinking in the fact that he was still here, and Percy realized he felt the same way. The world was collapsing, and the one thing that mattered to Percy that very moment was that Annabeth was alive. She blinked the tears out of her eyes and said, "There might have been a time I thought, well, you were like a brother to me, Luke," she continued. "But no, I didn't love you. Not like that anyway." He nodded, like he expected that. "It'll be all right," Grover said. "We can get some ambrosia. We can—" "Grover," Luke gulped, "you're the bravest satyr I've ever known. But there's no healing this." He coughed and tugged at Percy's sleeve. "Percy, Ethan, me, my old cabin mates, all the unclaimed," he said sadly. "Please, don't let it happen again. Promise me, they'll all be claimed. Don't let them be forgotten. Please." "Okay, I won't," Percy said. "I promise." "And promise me," Luke continued crying, "whatever happens, you make sure she stays alive. Promise me you'll protect her. And promise, whatever it takes, you'll make sure she lives a happy life, because she deserves so much better than all of this." Percy looked at Annabeth, who was at a loss for words. Then he looked back at Luke, blinked the tears out of his eyes, and said, "Okay, I will. I promise." Luke's hand went slack. A tear dripped down his face as his eyes closed. Luke was dead. The throne room doors thundered open, and the Olympians marched in like they were expecting a battle. Instead, they stared in awe at the kids kneeling over Luke's corpse. Hermes ran and got down next to his son. "Oh, no, 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 no." Then the three Fates appeared behind them, with a shroud prepared for Luke. Percy hadn't seen those creepy ladies in forever. He still remembered the first time he'd seen them on a road trip home from Yancey Academy, and he saw them snip a lifeline. He'd only been 12 years old and hadn't yet realized who they were, or what he was. They scared him then, and they scared him now. One of them looked at Percy straight in the eye, and his life flashed before him. So many points of his life flashed one after the other, from present time all the way up to his own funeral. "It is done," the lady said. She held up a piece of string snipped in half, and Percy knew it was the exact same one they had snipped all those years ago. "That wasn't my lifeline, was it?" Percy asked. "It was Luke's all along." "Yes, Percy Jackson," she said, "and don't worry. There's more to your story that has yet to be told." As they loaded Luke up on the shroud, Hermes asked them to wait a moment, and he whispered a blessing in ancient Greek. "Farewell, my son," he whispered. As they carried Luke away, Percy thought about Luke's mom, How she would never realize that her only son would never come home, no matter how many cookies and sandwiches she made. Then he thought about the prophecy. A hero's soul cursed blade shall reap. This whole time, the big decision Percy had to make was to decide to give Luke that dagger. The exact same dagger Luke had given Annabeth all those years ago. It was cursed because Luke had broken his promise and betrayed his friends. A single choice shall end his days. That choice was to give Luke the knife and believe just as Annabeth had that Luke was still capable of setting things right, even if it meant sacrificing himself. Olympus to preserve or raise. By sacrificing himself, Luke had saved Olympus. It turned out that Percy wasn't the hero, just as Rachel had said. It had always been Luke. Percy was just the one to make sure it went as planned. The fates had shown him which life had to be sacrificed in order to set things right. Percy also understood something else. When Luke descended into the river Styx, he would have had to focus on something important, something that anchored him to his mortal life. Otherwise, he would have dissolved. Percy had seen Annabeth, and he had a feeling Luke had too. He must have seen that same scene Hestia had shown Percy of Luke traveling with Annabeth and Thalia back when he promised they would be a family. Hurting Annabeth in battle had shocked him into remembering that promise. It had allowed his mortal conscience to take over again and defeat Kronos. His Achilles' heel had saved them all. The next few hours were a blur. No one noticed until last minute that it was well after midnight when Luke died. Percy remembered his promise to his mom. Zeus didn't even blink when Percy told him his request. He snapped his fingers and the lights at the top of the Empire State glowed blue. The mortals would just have to wonder what it meant, but Percy's mom knew. He was safe and the fighting was over. Preparing the throne room wasn't too hard since the Olympians had super speed. Once the sky bridge was repaired, they greeted their friends who had survived. The Cyclopes had helped Thalia, and she was currently on crutches. The Stoll brothers told Percy that Sally and Paul were all right, though they weren't allowed on Olympus. They also mentioned that Mrs. O'Leary managed to dig out Chiron from the rubble and carry him back to camp, and Chiron was still perfectly alive. Katie Gardner had reported that Rachel ran out of the Empire State Building at the end of the battle. They said she didn't look hurt when they saw her, but no one knew where she ran off to, which started to trouble Percy. Nico arrived with a hero's welcome. He got pats on the back and some compliments, which he didn't seem to mind, though he didn't give any replies. Hades looked stunned when his relatives clapped him on the back. Percy doubted he ever got such an enthusiastic welcome before. Clarice marched in, and Ares exclaimed,
"There's my girl! Come here, you!"
She felt a little overwhelmed, but eventually she began to smile. Percy couldn't help but feel happy for her. Then Hera came up to him. She sniffed it in disdain and then said, "I suppose I won't destroy you and the Athena girl now." "She did help me save your palace, you know," Percy said. "She was the one who convinced Luke to stop Kronos." She whirled away in a huff, but Percy figured their lives would be safe, at least for a little while. Then Dionysus walked up to him.
"Well, Percy Jackson," he said, "I see Pollux has made it through, so I suppose you aren't completely useless. It's all thanks to my training, I suppose."
"Right, thanks," Percy said.
"No," Mr. D said. "Thank you. As thanks for my bravery, Zeus has cut my probation in half, so now I only have 50 years left rather than 100 to put up with that miserable camp."
Percy tried to picture how he would put up with Mr. D until he was an old man, assuming he never lived that long.
"Don't get too excited, Johnson," he said. "I'm still planning on making your life very miserable."
Percy couldn't help but smile. "Naturally," he said.
"Indeed,"